In 1893, a junior curator at the University of Pennsylvania Museum unpacked a clay tablet from a crate shipped from the ancient city of Nippur. The text described the creation of human beings, not born, manufactured. The Sumerian account specified ingredients: clay from the earth, blood from a slaughtered god, and a substance the scribe called the essence that carries memory. The tablet was catalogued, translated, and filed. 80 years later, molecular biologists sequencing the human genome discovered that 98% of human DNA does not code for proteins. No one could explain why. The Sumerians had already written the answer. The tablet, known as CBS 8383, sits in the storage collection of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. It was excavated from the temple library at Nippur in modern Iraq during the expedition from 1893 to 1896, led by John Henry Haynes. The text was first translated in fragments by Stephen Langdon in 1915, and later reconstructed in full by Samuel Noah Kramer, who published his landmark reading in 1944 under the title Sumerian Mythology. The tablet contains one of the oldest known accounts of the creation of human beings. It is not a prayer, it is not a hymn, it is a production report. The narrative belongs to a composition now called Enki and Ninmah. The text opens with a crisis among the gods. The junior deities, called the Igigi, have been assigned to dig canals, haul earth, and maintain the irrigation systems that sustain the divine realm. The labor is crushing. The Igigi protest. The Sumerian verb used for their response is shubalbal, meaning to overturn or rebel. They refuse to continue. The senior gods, the Anunnaki, convene a council to resolve the problem. The solution is not negotiation. It is engineering. Enki, the god of wisdom and subterranean waters, proposes the creation of a substitute species. The raw material is clay drawn from the earth above the Abzu, Enki's freshwater domain beneath the surface. But clay alone is inert. The text specifies that the clay must be mixed with something divine. In the parallel account preserved in the Atrahasis epic, the ingredient is explicit. A god named Wei'ilu is slaughtered. His flesh and blood are blended into the clay. The Akkadian term used is tēmu, meaning reason or intelligence. The divine blood carries the capacity for thought. The resulting mixture produces the first human. The mother goddess performs the shaping. In Enki and Ninmah, she is called Ninmah. In Atrahasis, she is Mummy or Nintu. The text describes her pinching off 14 pieces of the prepared clay, 7 placed to the left, 7 to the right, a brick placed between them, 7 male forms, 7 female forms. The language is procedural, no awe, no ceremony. The scribe records the production of a labor force with the same administrative precision used elsewhere to document grain shipments and canal maintenance schedules. The Atrahasis text adds a detail that Enki and Ninmah does not. After the creation, the text states that the ghost of the slaughtered god remained in the clay, so that the living might not forget. The Akkadian word is a tēmu, meaning spirit or ghost. The divine component is not merely biological, it carries memory, it carries identity. Whatever was taken from the slaughtered god and placed into the human form was understood by the scribe as the element that separates a living being from shaped earth. Not breath, not movement, memory. The Enki and Ninmah text then describes something that has no parallel in any other ancient creation account. After the initial successful creation, Enki and the mother goddess engage in what reads as a series of experiments. They produce variant humans. One cannot close its hands. One cannot see. One cannot walk. One cannot hold urine. The text lists 6 or 7 defective models, depending on the reconstruction, each with a specific functional failure. Enki assigns social roles to each, finding occupations that accommodate their limitations. The scribe records these variants without moral commentary. They are documented as production outcomes, successful parameters and failed parameters, logged with equal precision. For 3,500 years, these texts were read as mythology, creation stories, theological narratives explaining why humans exist and why they suffer. The standard scholarly interpretation, maintained from Kramer through Thorkild Jacobson and into the present, treats the creation accounts as reflections of Mesopotamian social structure. Humans were made to work because Mesopotamian society was built on labor. The gods mirror the ruling class. The myths legitimize hierarchy. Then in 1976, Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet. Sitchin could read cuneiform. He had studied at the London School of Economics and claimed training in ancient languages. His reading of the same text reached conclusions that no accredited Assyriologist had proposed or would endorse. Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were not metaphorical deities, but extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru. The creation of humans was not myth, but a record of genetic engineering. The clay was biological raw material. The divine blood was DNA. The mixing process was gene splicing. The defective variants in Enki and Ninmah were failed experiments in a biological laboratory. Sitchin pointed to specific textual details. The term shiru, meaning flesh, he interpreted as a reference to genetic material. The term napishtu, meaning life or breath, he read as a designation for the biological essence transferred during the procedure. The brick placed between the 7 male and 7 female forms he identified as a laboratory apparatus. Every element of the creation narrative was remapped from theological allegory onto a framework of advanced biotechnology performed by a non-human intelligence. The academic response was silence, not rebuttal, silence. Mainstream Assyriology did not engage with Sitchin's claims in peer-reviewed literature. The texts Sitchin cited were real. The translations he offered were selective, but not fabricated from nothing. He read cuneiform signs that exist on tablets, that exist in museums that exist. His interpretive framework was rejected not through published counter-argument, but through institutional exclusion. No journal reviewed his work. No conference invited his response. And then the Human Genome Project delivered its results. In 2003, the completed sequence of the human genome confirmed what preliminary data had suggested for years. Approximately 98.5% of human DNA does not code for proteins. The term that had attached itself to this discovery decades earlier was junk DNA, coined by geneticist Susumu Ono in 1972. The word junk implied purposelessness. Nearly the entire human genome appeared to be functionless residue, evolutionary debris, sequences that did nothing. Speculative writers seized the gap. If 98% of human DNA was inactive, perhaps it had been deliberately deactivated. If the Sumerians described a creation process involving selective use of divine material, perhaps the unused DNA was the portion the engineers chose not to activate. The myth and the science were stitched together at the point where both contained a mystery neither could resolve alone. The term junk DNA was never accurate. Susumu Ono coined it in 1972 as a shorthand for sequences whose function had not been identified, not as a declaration that no function existed. The distinction matters because the entire speculative framework connecting Sumerian creation myths to genetic engineering depends on a misreading of what geneticists actually claimed. Scientists did not say 98% of DNA was purposeless. They said they did not yet know what it did. The gap between those two statements is where an entire mythology of alien genetic modification was constructed. The ENCODE project, launched in 2003 and publishing its first major results in 2012, began closing that gap. A consortium of 442 researchers across 32 institutions analyzed the biochemical activity of the human genome and found that approximately 80% of non-coding DNA showed evidence of function. Not protein coding function, regulatory function, switches that turn genes on and off, enhancers that amplify expression, silencers that suppress it, promoters that initiate transcription, insulators that prevent one gene's regulatory signals from affecting its neighbors. The genome was not a factory with 2% of its machinery running and 98% rusted into silence. It was a control system. The non-coding regions were not junk. They were the management layer. This did not stop the speculative interpretation. If anything, it refined it. Writers who had previously claimed the DNA was deactivated now claimed it had been deliberately restructured. The regulatory architecture itself became evidence of engineering. The complexity of the control system, the argument went, was too precise, too layered, too efficient to have emerged through random mutation and natural selection alone. The Sumerian texts describing the gods' careful, methodical construction of the human form were cited as confirmation. Enki did not merely create, he designed. The defective variants in Enki and Ninmah were not mythological curiosities, they were prototypes. The side-by-side comparison between what the ancient texts actually describe and what the speculative interpretation claims reveals a consistent pattern of substitution. Where the text says clay, the interpretation reads biological substrate. Where the text says divine blood, the interpretation reads genetic material. Where the text says the ghost remained so the living might not forget, the interpretation reads encoded memory in DNA sequences. Each substitution is individually plausible as metaphor. Collectively, they form a closed interpretive system where every element of the myth confirms the thesis, because every element has been pre-assigned a modern equivalent. The method is circular. The appeal is that the circle feels seamless. What mainstream Assyriology concludes about these texts is less dramatic but more defensible. Thorkild Jacobson, whose 1976 work, The Treasures of Darkness, remains a foundational study of Mesopotamian religious thought, interpreted the creation myths as reflections of how Mesopotamian society understood its own structure. Humans were made to work because work defined human existence in a society built on irrigated agriculture. The gods mirror the ruling elite. The creation of humanity from divine and earthly material encodes a philosophical claim about human nature. Humans are partly divine, capable of reason, memory, and language. Humans are partly earth, bound to labor, decay, and death. The myths do not describe what happened. They describe what the Mesopotamians believed about what they were. The symbolic reading accounts for the evidence without requiring an extraterrestrial hypothesis. But it does not account for everything. The procedural precision of the texts, the specific numbering, the trial and error production sequence, the explicit statement that divine memory was embedded in the created beings, these details carry a weight that pure allegory does not fully explain. Not because they require a literal reading, because they suggest that whoever composed these narratives was encoding something more specific than a generic theological claim. The myths read less like stories about gods and more like institutional records translated into the only framework the culture had available. The framework was theological. What was being recorded through it may not have been. Mainstream scholars do not engage with the speculative claims publicly. The reason is structural, not conspiratorial. Academic Assyriology operates within peer-reviewed systems that require falsifiable hypotheses and reproducible methodology. Sitchin's framework is not falsifiable. It cannot be tested against the evidence because it reinterprets all evidence as confirmation. Engaging with it in a journal would grant it the status of a competing hypothesis, which it is not by the standards of the discipline. The silence is not suppression, it is a boundary marker, but the effect of that silence is that the speculative interpretation circulates without formal challenge in spaces where millions encounter it and where no academic counter-argument is present. The tablets remain in museums. CBS 8383 is in Philadelphia. The Atrahasis tablets are split between the British Museum in London and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The texts say what they have always said. The gods grew tired of working. They killed one of their own. They mixed his essence into the earth. They shaped 14 figures. They gave them memory, they gave them labor, they gave them death. The Human Genome Project confirmed that 98.5% of human DNA does not code for proteins. The ENCODE project confirmed that much of it regulates the 1.5% that does. The gap between what the ancients described and what the moderns discovered is not a gap of evidence. It is a gap of interpretation. If the myths are purely symbolic, why do they describe creation as a manufacturing process with quality control failures? If the DNA is fully mapped, why did it take 40 years to recognize that the non-coding regions were functional? If the speculative reading is wrong, why does it persist in cultures that have access to the corrections? The Sumerians pressed their account into clay because clay survives. The genome carries its own record because DNA persists. Both archives exist. Both are incomplete. Both describe humanity as something that was made, not something that simply appeared. The tablets do not answer the question of who made us. They record that the question was asked 4,000 years ago, in the same terms, with the same unease, by scribes who wrote on clay because they understood that some records must outlast the civilizations that produced them. The clay survived. The question remains open.